Hi, this is Jove Aguas, and welcome to my lectures on ethics. For this lecture, I will be discussing about Epicurean ethics. I will start with a quote from Epicurus' letter to Menoetius. Therefore, both old and young alike ought to seek wisdom. The former, in order that, as age comes over him, he may be young in good things, because of the grace of what has been, and the latter, in order that while he is young, he may at the same time be old, because he has no fear of the things which are to come. Epicurus from the letter of Menoetius, or letter to Menoetius. Introduction. Epicureanism was one of the philosophies that arose during the decline of ancient Greek philosophy as a source of relief from increasing social disorganization. So, Epicureanism was one of the post Socratic philosophies. After the time of Aristotle, Greek philosophy was sort of in a decline. So, highest point of Greek philosophy was Aristotle, and then of course nobody could, be better than Aristotle. So there was a decline in Greek philosophy. But there were a number of good philosophies during the post Socratic era: Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, and many others, Neoplatonism. And one of those that really sort of filled the vacuum left by the Aristotelian philosophy was Epicureanism. It is considered one of the salvation philosophies, which flourished until the Greco Roman culture was superseded by Christian or by Christianity. Salvation philosophies because at least it provides us with some sort of a positive, a good vibe, so to speak, after the uh, the philosophy of Aristotle. Epicureanism distinguished itself for the constancy of its doctrine. The founder of Epicureanism was, of course, Epicurus. He lived from 342 to 270 BC. He was born and educated in Samos, and he inherited Athenian citizenship from his parents. After the death of Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great was the student of Aristotle, the Athenians were driven out of Samos, and Epicurus went to Asia Minor, where he taught for several years. And later he returned to Athens and taught in his famous garden, the Garden of Epicurus, until his death in 270 BC. Epicurus was warmly affectionate to his followers, and his followers were actually very devoted to him. Though, of course, he was not spared from some, some scandals and some from some false accusations during his life. So that could be a good picture of the Epicurean garden or the garden of Epicurus. Until now, there are still people, even in our present time, the Epicurean garden is a model of serenity. So it is patterned after the original garden of Epicurus. The garden served as a sanctuary from the turmoil of the outer world for a select group of men who applied in their daily lives the precepts of their mentor Epicurus. Epicurus taught that happiness involves serenity, and is achieved through the simple pleasures which preserve bodily health and peace of mind. The enemies, however, of Epicurus accuse him of sensualism. But of course, his philosophical teachings and the frugality and simplicity of his life effectively refuted this charge. It was the nobility of his character that accounted for his popularity. So he drew so many followers to himself. So Epicurus was not just any ordinary teacher. He was a master, and he attracted, just like the other philosophers that we have discussed, he attracted many good philosophers or followers. I'm sorry. For Epicurus, the whole point of philosophy is to heal the souls and to enable us to live a happy life. So again, a happy life that is something that is common among the Greek philosophers. He disdains theoretical speculation and stresses that philosophy should serve practical human needs. He says there is no benefit from philosophy if it cannot drive out the disease of the soul. Now, his basic principle, pleasure as the purpose of life. Philosophy is the art of making life happy, as Epicurus. Prudence is the noblest part of philosophy. The purpose of life, according to Epicurus, is personal happiness. And by happiness, he means pleasure itself. Pleasure itself. Pleasure is the alpha and omega of a happy life. It is the first and kindred good and the starting point of every choice and of every aversion. Because pleasure is the first and native good, we do not choose every pleasure whatever, but often pass over many pleasures when a greater discomfort ensues from them. If you achieve this pleasure, but if this pleasure will give you discomfort, then you pass over the pleasure, move on to the next, to the higher pleasure, the higher pleasure, the pleasure with the least discomfort. The pleasure is a state equably diffused, the absence of bodily pain and mental anxiety. Epicurus says, that which begets the pleasurable life is not sensual indulgence, but a sober reason which searches for the grounds of choosing and rejecting, and which banishes these doctrines, through which mental trouble, for the most part, arises. So, if you think of pleasure as physical or sensual pleasure, that is not the right interpretation. Because pleasure for Epicurus is something that is mental or spiritual. Aside from Epicurus, there's a group of philosophers who also stress pleasure. There are the Serene. They stress physical pleasure. The Cyrenaic doctrine, which was formulated by Aristippus, a student of Socrates, who ironically advocates the hedonistic principle that pleasure is the supreme good. The Cyrenaic look to the momentary pleasures of gaiety and excitement, physical, sensual pleasure. Epicurus and the Cyrenaic, or Aristippus, both maintain that human nature is so constituted that people always seek what they believe will give them pleasure and avoid pain. Both believe that pleasure is the only intrinsic good and pain is the only intrinsic evil. They both encourage people to choose pleasure judiciously, for the means that produce some pleasures bring with them disturbances that are a lot greater than pleasures themselves. And both teach that the person who wishes to be happy must cultivate the ability to choose the right pleasures, and that only the action that further the enjoyment of individuals can have moral significance. However, they differ significantly in the kind of pleasure that we have to pursue. While Epicurus equates pleasure with peace of the mind, spiritual serenity, Aristippus identifies pleasure with sensual or physical pleasures. Epicurus maintains that the duration of pleasure is more important than their intensity in achieving happiness. Therefore, mental pleasures are superior than physical, since they last longer although less intense. Sensual pleasure is so intense, right? But the problem with that is it does not last very long. Mental or spiritual pleasure, on the other hand, may not be as intense. In fact, very few people ever reach the highest intensity of spiritual or mental pleasure. But its duration is longer than sensual pleasure. So, although he finds the physical pleasure to be acceptable in themselves, he contends that the pursuit of them for their own sake does not lead to happiness. If we pursue physical pleasure, sensual pleasure, only for the sake of pleasure itself, it will not lead us to happiness. Meaning to say, for Aristippus, we still have, or for Epicurus, we still have to pursue physical pleasure, not for pleasure sake. Experience show that desire for a life filled with intense pleasure will be frustrated because there is inadequacy of them in the normal course of events. You always end up desiring more and more and more. Furthermore, the pleasure derived from goals like fame, wealth, and the like, or sensual pleasure like sexual pleasure, are usually outweighed by the pains necessary to produce them. And the pain that results from such activities like, for example, drinking, partying, merrymaking, either cancels the pleasure or leaves a balance of pain. So if you spend the whole night merrymaking, partying, and drinking, you have a whole night of pleasure. But the following day, how do you feel? Headache, body ache, see, and all the discomforts. And you think, is it worth all the night long pleasure? Hence, the most intense physical or sensual pleasure is self-defeating because you will always crave for more and more and more. You are never really satisfied. The active and passive pleasure. The active or positive pleasure comes from the gratification of specific wants or desires, and the passive or negative pleasures come from the absence of pain. While Aristippus and his followers sets the goal of life as a constant seeking of active and positive pleasure, Epicurus maintains that the active pleasure are important insofar as they terminate the pain of unfulfilled desires. So we don't uh, aspire for the active pleasure only for the sake of the pleasure, but for the sake of terminating pain. For Epicurus, the passive pleasures are more fundamental than the active because it is through them that happiness can be gained. A person's ultimate goal is not a constant succession of intense sensual pleasure, but rather a state of serenity or ataraxia, which characterizes freedom from trouble in mind and pain in the body. Epicurus assures that the calm and repose of the good life are within the reach of all, that everyone is capable of attaining a life of serenity. Epicurus categorizes our desires. He says, one must reckon that of desires, some are natural, some groundless, and of the natural desires, some are necessary, and some merely natural. And of the necessary, some are necessary for happiness, and some are for freeing the body from troubles, and some for itself. So here, the desires could be artificial or natural. The artificial example could be fame, material luxury, power, etc. The natural could be unnecessary or necessary. Like unnecessary, you have delicious food. Necessary, necessary for happiness, wisdom and friendship. For comfort, adequate clothing. For life, water and food. And in this time of quarantine, we really see the difference of all these desires. So we have to just stick to what is necessary. And if there's a good thing that really this COVID 19 has brought us, is for us to realize what are the necessary or essential things in life. It's necessary to keep our desires at the minimum and distinguish the natural and necessary desires like health and tranquility from those that are artificial like wealth, excitement, and fame. Now we realize that we don't really need them, these artificial desires. The artificial are not just unnecessary. They are sometimes destructive of the natural and necessary desires. The satisfaction of the necessary desires, that is, those that preserve bodily health and mental peace, and the freedom from pain that accompanies such satisfaction, are those that will lead to happiness. Meaning, we have, if you want to be happy, minimize your desires. It's important that at least we don't experience the pain. When you desire more, you suffer more because we don't always get what we desire. Knowledge in the pursuit of the right pleasure. Our good can be realized through philosophy, the quest for knowledge that is practical knowledge. Hence, philosophy must have some practical application, otherwise it is useless. By nature, men seek pleasure, but it is knowledge that will guide them to the choice of the right pleasures. Without deliberation, it is impossible to hinder needless and artificial desires and to secure the right pleasure needed to attain happiness. In order to understand how we should live, in order to enjoy the most pleasant and serene existence, we must know the nature of the various desires and the different pleasures which come from their satisfaction. Reflection on the desires will lead us to view that frugality and simplicity are the true roads to happiness. Yes, of course, we need the physical pleasures. We need these things that will give us comfort, but only to the extent that they will end our discomfort. We never desire them for their own sake. The key to happiness is living a simple, frugal life. Minimize our desires, moderate our desires. Mere sensual enjoyment leads ultimately to unhappiness. Just as a good digestion keeps the body well, philosophical contemplation keeps the mind at peace. So we all have to attain or to, pursue mental serenity. You may be popular, but if because of your popularity, you may have offended somebody, how can you be so calm and so composed and so comfortable in your life? But if you just live a simple life, you'll be content, you'll be happy. So prudence. The overall virtue then that must be cultivated is prudence. It is the most valuable of all moral attributes and the source of all virtues by which we live. We are able to live happily. The prudent person is one who truly knows what the truly good things are, easy to obtain, and that evils are either short-lived or slight. Remember, the more intense, the less durable. The less intense, more it will last long. That's the difference between physical pleasure and spiritual pleasure. The prudent person knows that he himself and not destiny controls the factors that will bring him happiness. The prudent person has the power to turn chance occurrence into good account. And the prudent person chooses wise decision rather than the fortunate outcome. Don't rely on luck. Hard work works. Aside from prudence, the following characterize the life of a happy person: self-sufficiency, sober reasoning, honor, justice, wisdom, health of the body, and peace of mind. And according to Epicurus, plain food. Epicureans, although live a very virtuous life, but they do not consider moral virtues a matter of excellence or something that needs to be pursued for its own sake. That's different from the other philosophers that we have discussed. Virtue is a means towards individual pleasure, mental serenity, spiritual pleasure. That's why in some of my discussions I mentioned that Epicurus is one of the egoists philosophers. Epicurus says one must honor the noble and the virtues and things like that if they produce pleasure. But if they do not, we must bid them goodbye. So, I hope you have learned some moral lessons from this presentation. But if I have to leave you with one thing, the key to a happy life is a simple life. Thank you very much for listening. And as I always say, be safe and God bless.